He was 18 years old, aged out of the system with nothing but a worn backpack and a letter from a lawyer he'd never met. He inherited a derelict farm in a place he couldn't find on a map, a place that was supposed to be his last chance. But what he discovered, buried beneath the rotted floor of a forgotten barn, wasn't a treasure, but a truth that would force him to fight for more than just the land. If you've ever felt like you were starting from nothing, or if you've ever had to find your own definition of home, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to get into it, and I promise you, what I found there wasn't just about a farm. The bus groaned, a long, weary sigh of hydraulics as it pulled away from the curb, taking with it the last familiar smells of the city: exhaust fumes, damp concrete, and the faint, greasy scent of street food. I pressed my forehead against the cool, vibrating glass and watched the gray monoliths of my childhood slide past, their windows like 1,000 indifferent eyes. 18 years. 18 years of moving between homes that were never mine, of sleeping in beds that remembered the shapes of other boys, of memorizing the quiet creaks of unfamiliar hallways. And now it was over. The state of Illinois, in its infinite and bureaucratic wisdom, had declared me an adult. The finality of it was a strange, hollow feeling in my gut, like a door slamming shut in an empty house. My entire life was compressed into the faded green backpack sitting on the seat beside me. 3 t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a worn copy of a book I'd read a dozen times, and a thin manila envelope. The envelope was the reason I was on this bus, heading north into a sea of green and brown I'd only ever seen from airplane windows on TV. Inside was a letter from a woman named Eleanor Albright, attorney at law, and a deed. A deed to a place called Blackwood Farm, near a town called Havenwood, my grandfather's farm. A man I couldn't remember, a ghost who had apparently left me his own ghost of a home. The social worker, Mrs. Gable, had handed me the envelope that morning with a look of practiced pity. "It's not much, Leo," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm, the same tone she used when telling kids their weekend visit was canceled. "The property taxes haven't been paid in years. There's a significant lien on it, and a standing offer from a development group. Honestly, the offer is your best bet. It would be a clean start." A clean start. The words echoed in my head. All my life I'd been promised clean starts. A new foster home, a new school, a new set of rules to learn and break. They never felt clean. They felt like wiping a dirty slate with a dirty rag. This offer, though, it was tangible. $40,000. To me, it was an impossible number. A mythical sum that could buy 1,000 clean starts. I could get an apartment, a real one, with my own name on the lease. I could go to community college, maybe. I could eat something other than instant noodles and the charity of others. It was the smart choice, the logical choice. Mrs. Gable had already circled the developer's phone number on the letterhead. "Just call them, Leo. They'll handle everything." But I hadn't called. Instead, I'd taken the last of my foster care stipend and bought a one-way bus ticket to a town I'd never heard of. It was a stupid decision, born of something I couldn't name. It wasn't hope, not really. It was more like a stubborn, weary curiosity. I wanted to see it. I wanted to stand on a piece of ground, however ruined, and know that it was, in some legal, binding way, mine. For someone who had never owned anything more valuable than a second-hand pair of sneakers, the idea was a strange, heavy anchor in the churning sea of my uncertainty. The city dissolved into suburbs, then into sprawling stretches of highway lined with skeletal trees just beginning to bud. The sky was a vast, unforgiving gray, the color of dishwater. I watched the miles tick by on the digital sign at the front of the bus, each one a small severance from the only life I'd known. I wasn't sad to leave it. You can't be sad to leave a place that was never truly yours. But I was scared. A deep, cold fear that felt like ice water in my veins. I was 18 years old and utterly, terrifyingly alone. The bus ride was 12 hours long. I slept in fits, my head knocking against the window, dreaming of locked doors and empty rooms. When I was awake, I read the letter from Ms. Albright again and again, tracing the elegant, sharp cursive of her signature. Her tone was professional, distant. She outlined the facts. My grandfather, Arthur Blackwood, had passed away 2 years prior. I was his sole heir. The property consisted of 120 acres, a farmhouse, a barn, and several outbuildings, all in a state of advanced disrepair. The debt, including back taxes and a private loan, totaled nearly $32,000. The offer from Northridge Holdings was for $40,000. After the debts were settled, I would walk away with $8,000. $8,000 and a clean start. It still sounded like a fortune. It sounded like the only sane path forward. Yet here I was, rattling north in a bus that smelled of disinfectant and despair. The town of Havenwood wasn't so much a town as a suggestion of one. The bus didn't even pull into a station, just a gravel turnout next to a gas station with a flickering sign. I was the only one who got off. The air was different here. It was clean, sharp, and cold, filled with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the gas station's coolers from 50 yards away. The silence was unnerving. I was used to the constant anonymous roar of the city, the symphony of sirens, traffic, and shouting that was the soundtrack to my life. This quiet felt loud. It felt like it was listening to me. A single taxi, a dusty sedan that might have been yellow a decade ago, was parked by the air pump. The driver was an old man with a face like a road map and hands thick with calluses. He looked me up and down, my city clothes and my worn-out backpack, and seemed to understand everything without me saying a word. "Where to, son?" His voice was gravelly, low. "Blackwood Farm," I said, the name feeling foreign on my tongue. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something, pity, recognition, in his pale blue eyes. "Arthur's place. Haven't been out that way in a while." The ride was mostly silent. He drove not with the frantic, aggressive rhythm of a city cabbie, but with a slow, methodical patience, as if he were navigating a river instead of a road. We left the small cluster of buildings that made up Havenwood and plunged into a landscape of rolling hills and dense, dark woods. The paved road turned to gravel, then to a rutted dirt track that seemed to be actively trying to reclaim itself for the forest. Finally, the driver slowed the car and pointed through the dusty windshield. "That's it. End of the line." I looked, and my heart, which had been a tight, nervous knot in my chest, sank. It wasn't a farm. It was a ruin. A skeleton picked clean by time and neglect. The driveway was a tunnel through a thicket of thorns and overgrown weeds, leading to a farmhouse whose porch was sagging like a tired old man. The paint had peeled off in long, leprous strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. Windows were boarded up or broken, dark, vacant eyes in a tired face. Beside it stood the barn, a massive structure whose roof had a severe, sway-backed dip in the middle, looking as if one strong wind would bring the whole thing crashing down. The fields on either side were choked with weeds as tall as I was. Mrs. Gable's words came back to me. "It's not much." She was a master of understatement. I paid the driver the last of my cash, leaving me with 2 crumpled $5 bills and some change. He hesitated before taking it, his eyes on the wreck of the farmhouse. "You sure about this, son? There's a motel back in town. Clean, cheap." "I'm sure," I lied. He nodded again, that same slow, knowing gesture. "All right. Holler if you need anything. Name's George. My number's on the card on the dash." He didn't wait for me to take one. He just put the car in gear and rumbled away, leaving me alone in a cloud of dust and the oppressive, listening silence. I stood there for a long time, the backpack feeling impossibly heavy on my shoulders. The sheer, overwhelming reality of the place was a physical blow. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a demolition site. The developer's $40,000 suddenly seemed less like a good offer and more like an act of charity. I walked up the choked driveway, thorns catching at my jeans. The front door of the house was locked, its wood swollen tight in the frame. I peered through a grimy, unbroken window into a room filled with shapes draped in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. I didn't have the energy to try and break in. Instead, my feet, seemingly of their own accord, carried me toward the barn. The huge double doors were slightly ajar, held by a thick loop of rusted chain. I managed to unhook it, and with a groan of protest from the hinges, I pulled one of the heavy doors open just enough to slip inside. The air in the barn was thick and musty, smelling of hay that had turned to dust, of engine oil, and of the slow, patient decay of wood. Shafts of pale light cut through the gloom from gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny, frantic constellations. It was vast. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, a cathedral of hand-hewn beams and intricate joinery. Empty stalls lined one wall, their gates hanging open. An ancient, rust-eaten tractor sat in the center of the floor, looking like the fossilized remains of some great metal beast. It was a wreck. It was falling apart. But there was something about it, a sense of strength, of history. I could feel the presence of the man who had built it, who had worked here. My grandfather. I dropped my backpack onto the dusty floor. This would have to be home, for now. The house felt too much like a tomb. The barn, for all its decay, felt alive. I spent the first few days in a daze of physical labor. I found a rusty push mower in a shed and spent an entire day clearing a path from the road to the barn. I used a crowbar to pry the boards off some of the farmhouse windows, letting in fresh air and sunlight for the first time in years. The inside of the house was a time capsule. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but it was all neat. The ghost-like sheets covered simple, sturdy furniture. In the kitchen, a calendar on the wall was still turned to May, 2 years ago. It felt like an intrusion, like walking through someone else's life after they'd just stepped out. I couldn't bring myself to sleep there. I found a stack of old grain sacks in the barn's loft and made a makeshift bed. It was cold, and the nights were filled with the skittering sounds of mice and the mournful hoot of an owl. But it felt more honest than sleeping in a dead man's bed. On the 4th day, a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled up the path I had cleared. A man in a suit that looked out of place in the rural landscape got out. He was holding a briefcase and had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Leo Blackwood?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. I nodded, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a dirty hand. "I'm Mark Renshaw from Northridge Holdings. I've been leaving messages with your attorney. Just thought I'd stop by, see if you'd had a chance to consider our offer." He gestured vaguely at the collapsing farmhouse, the overgrown fields. "We're prepared to handle all the paperwork, clear the debts. It's a very generous offer, considering the state of the property." His eyes swept over the place with a look of detached appraisal, like a butcher sizing up a piece of meat. He didn't see a home or a history. He saw a liability. He saw a number on a spreadsheet. "I'm thinking about it," I said, my voice sounding rougher than I intended. His smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Don't think too long. Offers like this have an expiration date. We're on a timeline. I'll leave you my card. You have my number. Let's get this done by the end of the week, shall we?" He placed the card on the hood of the rusty tractor, slid back into his car, and drove away. The business card felt like a contamination in the dusty air of the barn. $40,000. End of the week. The sane, logical part of my brain screamed at me to pick up the phone. I could be on a bus back to the city by nightfall, with enough money to disappear, to be anonymous, to be safe. But something held me back. It was the way he'd looked at the farm, the way he'd dismissed it. It felt personal. That night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, and the rain came down in solid, drumming sheets. The dip in the roof, which had seemed like a gentle curve in the daylight, now looked like a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. I could hear water dripping inside, a steady, ominous plinking sound. I knew I had to do something, anything, to try and divert it. I found an old canvas tarp in one of the stalls and dragged it up to the loft, hoping to cover the worst of the leak. The main floor of the barn was packed earth, but here in the loft, the floor was made of thick, wide planks of wood. They were warped and stained from years of moisture. As I wrestled with the heavy tarp, my foot snagged on a raised edge of one of the boards. I stumbled, and my full weight came down on it. There was a sharp crack, a sickening splintering sound, and the board gave way. My leg plunged through the floor up to my hip. For a moment, there was only searing pain and panicked confusion. I pulled myself out, my shins scraped and bleeding, my heart hammering against my ribs. I lay there on the dusty floor, breathing heavily, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof above me. After a minute, my panic subsided, replaced by a cautious curiosity. I crawled over to the hole I'd made. The board hadn't just broken. It had snapped clean off. I reached into the dark space below, my fingers brushing against not earth or insulation, but something hard, flat, and cold. Metal. My heart started beating faster again, but for a different reason. Using the crowbar I'd found earlier, I pried up the rest of the broken board and the ones next to it. The space below wasn't deep, maybe a foot of clearance between the floorboards and the massive support beams of the barn. And nestled there, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition can, heavy and solid, with a latch on the front. It was surprisingly clean, protected from the damp by the oilcloth wrapping. I lifted it out. It was heavy, not with the clinking weight of coins, but a dense, solid weight. I carried it over to a spot where the moonlight streamed through a high window and set it down. My hands were shaking as I worked the stiff latch. I wasn't thinking about treasure. I wasn't thinking about gold. I was thinking about the man who put it here. This was a hiding place, a place for secrets. What had my grandfather been so desperate to hide? The lid opened with a low groan. The inside was packed tight. There were no jewels, no stacks of cash. There was just one thing, a thick, leather-bound book, a ledger. I lifted it out. It was heavy in my hands, the leather dry and cracked with age. On the cover, in faded gold leaf, were 2 words, Blackwood Farm. I sat there on the floor of the loft, the storm raging outside, and opened the book. The first few pages were what you'd expect, neat columns of dates, descriptions, and figures. March 10th, seed corn, Miller's Feed and Supply, $45.50. March 18th, tractor repair, new fuel pump, $120. It was a meticulous record of the farm's lifeblood, written in a steady, surprisingly elegant hand. My grandfather's hand. I ran my fingers over the script, feeling a strange, hollow echo of connection. This was him. This was a piece of him. I kept turning the pages, going back through the years. The entries were consistent, practical, until they weren't. About 5 years back, the entries started to change. Sprinkled between the notes about fertilizer costs and harvest yields were other things. Short, handwritten notes in the margins. Renshaw from Northridge stopped by again. Same offer. Smells like a vulture. My blood went cold. Renshaw. The man in the suit. He'd been at this for years. Another entry, a few months later. Jim Peterson lost his farm today. Bank foreclosed. Northridge bought it at auction for pennies on the dollar. Jim said they held his loan. Said the terms kept changing. Something's not right. The ledger was no longer just about the farm. It was a journal. A chronicle of a quiet war I never knew was being fought. I read late into the night, the only light coming from my phone's dying battery. My grandfather's voice emerged from the pages, not as a ghost, but as a man, a proud, stubborn man who loved his land. He wrote about my mother, his daughter, who had run off to the city so young. He wrote with a deep, aching sadness, a bewilderment at the world she had chosen. She wants something I can't give her, one entry read. She thinks this dirt is a prison. I wish I could make her see that it's freedom. And then there was an entry that made me stop breathing. It was dated just over 18 years ago. Got a call from the city, from a hospital. It's a boy. She named him Leo. They won't let me see him. Say I'm not fit. A dirt farmer with no money. She's gone, they said. An overdose. My girl is gone, and they've taken her boy. I closed the book, my hands trembling. The words blurred through a sudden film of tears. I cried. I sat in the dusty loft of a ruined barn and cried for a mother I'd never met, for a grandfather I'd never known, and for the lost, lonely boy who was me. All my life I'd been told a simple, sterile story. My parents were gone, and I had no other family. It was a neat, tidy explanation that cauterized the wound before it could even bleed. But it was a lie. I had family. I had a grandfather who knew my name, who had tried to find me. They had kept him from me. The system, in its cold, impartial way, had decided I was better off an orphan than the grandson of a poor farmer. The anger that followed the grief was hot and sharp. It was a clean, pure rage that burned away some of the fear and confusion that had been my constant companions. They had lied to me. Everyone. All of them. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He had been erased. I stayed up the rest of the night, reading until my phone finally died, plunging me into darkness. The ledger told the rest of the story. Northridge Holdings wasn't just a development company. They were predators. My grandfather had started documenting their methods. They would identify struggling farms, offer the owners predatory loans through a third-party lender they secretly controlled, and then use legal loopholes and manufactured defaults to foreclose, snapping up the land for a fraction of its value. He had names, dates, loan documents he'd gotten from other farmers. He was building a case. "They are strangling this valley," he wrote. "They are turning good men into ghosts. Someone has to stop them." The last entry was dated 2 years ago, the month the calendar in the house was stuck on. "Renshaw knows I have it. He's getting careless. Threatened me today. Not in so many words, but I saw it in his eyes. I have to protect the boy. This ledger is the only thing I have to give him. It's not land or money. It's a choice. I'm putting it where no one will find it. If something happens to me, I pray that somehow this finds its way to him, to Leo. This land is his birthright. But the truth is his weapon. Forgive me, son. I wish I could have given you a better start." And that was it. The rest of the pages were blank. I sat in the darkness, the heavy book in my lap, the weight of his words settling over me. He hadn't just left me a farm. He'd left me a fight. He'd left me his legacy, and it wasn't 120 acres of weeds. It was a ledger full of dangerous truth. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in my entire life. The choice wasn't between taking the money and staying. It was between running, like I'd always done, or standing my ground for the first time ever. I walked into the farmhouse, the dust motes dancing in the morning light. It didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like my home. I spent the day cleaning, really cleaning. I pulled the sheets off the furniture, revealing simple, well-made wooden chairs and a sturdy oak table. I washed the windows, scrubbing away years of grime. I found his bedroom, a simple iron bed frame, a handmade quilt, a nightstand with a single book on it. The same book I had in my backpack. It was like looking at a version of myself, 60 years older. The connection was a physical ache in my chest. I knew what I had to do. I found the business card Renshaw had left. I called him. "Mr. Renshaw," I said, my voice steady. "Leo Blackwood. I've been thinking about your offer." "Excellent," he purred on the other end of the line. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up immediately." "No," I said. "I'm not accepting it. I'm rejecting it. And I'm letting you know that any further attempts to contact me will be considered harassment. Don't come back to my property." There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end. Then his voice changed. The smooth corporate veneer melted away, revealing something cold and ugly underneath. "You're making a big mistake, kid. You have no idea what you're dealing with. That farm is a hole, and it's going to swallow you whole. Take the money." "The offer has expired," I said, echoing his own words back at him, and I hung up. The feeling was electric. It was terrifying, but it was also the most powerful I had ever felt. I had made a choice. Not the smart choice, or the logical one, but my choice. My next call was to the number on the letterhead, to Eleanor Albright, attorney at law. Her secretary put me through immediately. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I was expecting your call. Have you decided to accept the offer from Northridge?" "No, Ms. Albright," I said, taking a deep breath. "I haven't, but I need to see you. I've found something. Something my grandfather left for me." I could almost hear her raise an eyebrow over the phone. "Oh? And what would that be?" "A ledger," I said. "I think you need to see it." There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional distance. It was sharper, more focused, more interested. "I have an opening at 10 tomorrow morning. Don't be late." The drive into town with George, the taxi driver, was different this time. I had called him from a payphone at the gas station, the only one for miles. He showed up in the same dusty sedan, but he looked at me differently. Maybe it was because I was cleaner, or maybe he saw something in my face that hadn't been there before. "Town," I said, getting in. He just nodded. "Heard you told that Renshaw fella to take a hike," he said as we rumbled down the dirt road. News traveled fast in a place like this. "How'd you hear that?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged, a slight smile touching his lips. "Mabel at the gas station has a nephew who does landscaping for one of the Northridge executives. Word gets around." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Took guts, kid. Arthur would have been proud." The validation from this stranger, this quiet old man, felt more meaningful than any praise I'd ever received from a social worker or a therapist. It felt real. Ms. Albright's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Havenwood's short Main Street. It was a small, tidy space, filled with law books and the smell of old paper. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked like someone who did not suffer fools gladly. She gestured for me to sit, and I placed the leather-bound ledger on her polished wooden desk. I didn't say anything. I just opened it to the first page where my grandfather had mentioned Northridge. She put on a pair of reading glasses and began to read. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the rustle of the turning pages and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Her expression remained neutral, but I could see a growing intensity in her eyes. She read for nearly an hour, her focus absolute. When she finally looked up, she took off her glasses and rubbed a bridge of her nose. "I was your grandfather's lawyer for 30 years, she said, her voice quiet. "He was a good man, stubborn as a mule, but his heart was in the right place. He told me he was looking into Northridge. He said they were crooks. I warned him to be careful." She tapped a long, manicured finger on the ledger. "I had no idea he'd put together something like this. This isn't just a journal, Mr. Blackwood. This is evidence. Meticulously documented evidence of racketeering, fraud, and intimidation." She looked at me, her gaze steady and serious. "Do you understand what you have here?" "I think so," I said, my throat dry. "This is why they want the farm. It's not about the land, it's about this book. They don't want to buy the property, they want to bury the evidence that's on it." "Exactly," she said, "which gives you a very dangerous, very powerful choice." She leaned forward. "Northridge is a subsidiary of a much larger corporation with very deep pockets and very skilled lawyers. If you use this to fight them, it will be long, it will be expensive, and it will be ugly. They will try to discredit you, to discredit your grandfather. They will try to bury you in legal fees." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "There is another option. This ledger, this is what they want. It is, to them, a multi-million-dollar liability. You could, hypothetically, sell it to them. Not for $40,000, for a lot more. Enough to disappear and live comfortably for the rest of your life. They would make you sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, and the whole thing would go away. The people your grandfather wrote about would never get justice. But you would be safe, and you would be rich. The silence in the office stretched on. It was the ultimate test. The clean start, magnified 100 times. Everything I'd ever thought I wanted. Security, freedom from want, the ability to walk away from everything and never look back. It was all right there, a simple transaction away. I thought about my grandfather, writing in this book by lamplight, fighting a lonely battle for his home and his neighbors. I thought about his last entry. It's a choice. He hadn't left me money. He hadn't left me an easy life. He'd left me a choice, to be the kind of man he was, or not. We fight them, I said. The words came out before I even had a chance to second-guess them. A slow, genuine smile spread across Eleanor Albright's face. It transformed her, softening the severe lines and making her sharp eyes gleam. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. "Your grandfather still had an outstanding retainer with me. Let's consider it your first down payment. Now let's get to work." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Ms. Albright began by filing a countersuit against Northridge Holdings, citing fraud and seeking to have the lien against the farm nullified. She also contacted the State Attorney General's office, sending them notarized copies of the most damning pages from the ledger. The corporate machine, as she had predicted, ground into motion. I received a deluge of official-looking letters, cease and desist orders, threats of lawsuits for defamation. Renshaw called me once, his voice a low snarl of promised retribution. I let Ms. Albright handle it. She was a bulldog, calm and relentless. While the legal battle raged in letters and court filings far from the farm, my own battle was with the land itself. I knew that if I was going to stay, if I was going to make this place my home, I couldn't let it lie fallow. I started small. I spent a week just clearing the weeds from around the house, uncovering a stone path and a small garden plot overrun with thorns. I found my grandfather's old tools in a shed, rusted but solid. I cleaned them, oiled them, sharpened them. Holding a shovel that his hands had worn smooth felt like a prayer. I started in the garden. I turned the soil, pulling out rocks and the stubborn roots of weeds. It was back-breaking work. Every muscle in my body ached. But with every shovelful of dark, rich earth, I felt like I was digging my own roots deeper into this place. One afternoon, as I was working, George's taxi rumbled up the driveway. He got out holding a cardboard box. "Figured you might be hungry," he said, handing it to me. Inside was a whole roasted chicken, potatoes, and a loaf of fresh bread. "My wife, Martha, she makes too much." I was so stunned I couldn't speak for a moment. I don't know what to say. Thank you." "Don't say anything," he grunted, though his eyes were kind. "Just eat. Arthur was a good man. It's good to see a Blackwood working this land again." He didn't stay long, but his small act of kindness was like rain on dry ground. I wasn't just the weird city kid in the abandoned farm anymore. I was Arthur's grandson. I was a Blackwood. That gesture opened a door. A few days later, a neighboring farmer named Bill, a man whose father was mentioned in the ledger, stopped by. He was a big, quiet man with a weathered face. He didn't say much. He just looked at the work I'd done, looked at the barn's sagging roof, and nodded. "Got some spare lumber and tar paper from a project last year," he said. "Be ashamed to let it rot. I can come by Saturday if you want a hand with that roof." And he did. He and his 2 teenage sons showed up Saturday morning with a truck full of supplies and a cooler full of sandwiches. We spent the entire weekend on that roof, pulling off rotten shingles, reinforcing the main beam, and laying down new tar paper. It was hard, dangerous work. But as we sat on the newly secured roof at the end of the day, drinking water and looking out over the valley, I felt a sense of belonging that was entirely new to me. I wasn't alone anymore. The community, the one Northridge had tried to dismantle, was slowly, cautiously, stitching itself back together around me. I was becoming a part of it. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to inherit something. Before, I thought it was about money, about property, a transaction. But I was wrong. What my grandfather left me wasn't just 120 acres and a pile of debt. He left me his story. He left me his fight. And he left me a community that he had fought to protect. He gave me a chance to have a history, to have roots. That's an inheritance you can't put a price on. And I know so many of you watching this have your own stories about inheritance, about finding out where you come from, about the complicated gifts our families leave us. If this is hitting home for you, I want you to know this channel is a community for people just like us, people who have been through it. So take a second to hit that subscribe button and maybe drop a comment down below and tell me a little bit about what home means to you. I read every single one. Now, let's get back to the story, because that weekend on the roof wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning of building something new. The legal fight was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Ms. Albright shielded me from the worst of it, but the pressure was constant. Northridge filed motion after motion, trying to drown us in paperwork, to bleed me dry. But my grandfather's meticulous records were our shield and our sword. The state attorney general's investigation was gaining traction, and other families, emboldened by my lawsuit, began to come forward with their own stories of predatory loans and intimidation. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. Life on the farm settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by court dates and legal deadlines. I finished the small garden and planted vegetables, tomatoes, beans, squash, things my grandfather had noted planting in his ledger. I found his old journals, separate from the ledger, filled with notes on crop rotation, soil health, and the quirks of the local weather. It was a masterclass in how to live on this specific patch of earth, and I was its only student. I fixed the plumbing in the house, learning from books I got at the town library. I chopped wood for the coming winter. Each repaired fence post, each cleared acre, each small victory against the decay felt like I was honoring him. I was breathing life back into his legacy. One evening in late autumn, Ms. Albright called me. Her voice was different. It was calm, but with an undercurrent of triumph. "They want to settle, Leo." I sat down heavily on the porch steps I had just finished rebuilding. Settle? The AG's investigation is about to go public. They're facing a massive class-action lawsuit from a dozen other families. Their parent company is cutting them loose to limit the damage. They're offering to forgive the entire fraudulent debt on your farm, pay all legal fees, and make a substantial contribution to a restitution fund for the other families. She paused. There's one condition. They want the original ledger. I looked out at the fields, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The ledger was sitting on the table inside. It felt like a part of me now, a sacred text. And if I say no? We can still win in court. It will just take longer and cost more. But Leo, you've already won the war. This is just negotiating the terms of surrender. I thought about the names in that book. Jim Peterson, the other farmers who had lost everything. This wasn't just about me and my farm anymore. It was about them. Give it to them, I said, on one condition. I want a public, written apology from Northridge to every family they targeted. I want it printed in the local paper." Ms. Albright was silent for a moment. Then she chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Arthur would be so damn proud of you," she said. "I'll draw up the terms." A few weeks later it was done. The lien on Blackwood Farm was gone. The deed was mine, free and clear. The Havenwood Gazette ran a full-page story, including the lengthy, legalese-filled apology from Northridge Holdings. It was a hollow statement, devoid of any real remorse, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was an admission. It was the truth, printed in black and white for everyone to see. That winter was long and cold, but for the first time in my life, I felt secure. I had a roof over my head, a roof I had helped repair, and a fire in the wood stove. I had food I had grown with my own hands. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a life. The community continued to embrace me in its quiet, understated way. George would drop off his wife's newspaper every morning. Bill would stop by to offer advice on my ancient tractor, which we had managed to bring back to life. I was invited to potluck dinners at the town grange, where I'd listen to the old-timers tell stories about my grandfather, filling in the missing pieces of the man I'd only known through his writing. They told me he was stubborn and quiet, but fair. They told me he was the first one to show up when a neighbor's barn burned down, and the last to leave. I saw his legacy not just in the ledger, but in the lives of the people he had cared about. I was no longer an outsider. I was Arthur Blackwood's grandson. I was home. The final piece fell into place on a cold, bright morning in early spring. A package arrived, a thick envelope with Ms. Albright's return address. Inside, there was no letter, just a single, old, dog-eared photograph. It was a picture of a young woman with my eyes and a defiant smile, holding a swaddled baby. Me. On the back, in my grandfather's familiar script, was written, "My daughter Sarah and my grandson Leo, my hope." Ms. Albright must have found it among his personal effects. He had kept a picture of me all this time. He had never stopped thinking of me. He had never given up hope. That photograph sits on the mantelpiece now, next to his old book. It's a daily reminder that home isn't just a place you inherit. It's something you build. It's a choice you make every single day. A choice to fight, to connect, to put down roots, even in the most neglected soil. My story isn't a fairy tale. The scars of my past are still there. The farm is still a lot of work. The grief for the family I never knew is a quiet, constant companion. But for the first time, I feel like my future is a wide open field, waiting to be planted. I am not defined by the system that raised me, or the loneliness that shaped me. I am defined by the choices I've made. I chose to see what was mine. I chose to read the story left for me. I chose to fight for a man I never met and a community I had just discovered. And in doing so, I found myself. So what I want to leave you with is this. Sometimes the greatest inheritances are the ones that don't come with a dollar sign. Sometimes they're a story, a struggle, a choice. They are the things that teach us who we are and who we can choose to be. Your past doesn't have to be your prison. It can be your foundation. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story. This community right here is built on people who understand that. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And I really want to hear from you. Go down to the comments and share one thing you've learned about yourself from your own family's story. You are not alone in this, and your story matters.